Thank you all so much for joining us this Saturday. Before I introduce myself and the panelists, I just want to quickly do a run through and a little disclaimer about this panel. First, the way that this is going to be framed is we're going to initially do introductions, then we're going to kind of have some direct input from these individuals' experiences about what it was like to manage medical and needs and disabilities when they were studying abroad or participating in an international exchange. And then we will get more into the technical piece to help more people that are interested in participating in an international exchange that might have similar concerns. And also just an opportunity to hear from what would be supportive from other staff. So the other thing I just want to quickly do a disclaimer on is that obviously this is a very broad topic. And though the panel is on the We Represent conference, I do want to just reiterate that it is impossible for any of us
Excuse the technical issues, folks. I assume that she will be back soon.
Yeah, Katie might have just dropped off for a minute, so let's see if she can get back in the next minute. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. I'm sure, as you all know, that this is a new platform for us, and we're all, kind of navigating it. So we appreciate your, patience and consideration for it. So yeah, let's wait a few minutes.
I like to joke in modern times, it's internet that delays you rather than flights. And I personally would rather have a poor internet connection than miss my flight connection. So although I wish we could all meet in person because I value in-person connections, it's just, it's a different roadblock for conferences.
It certainly is. Yeah, as much as technology can be our friend, it is also very much it can be not so much a friend, which, especially in cases like this, we really hope that it'll, have our back. That, in the next few seconds, if Katie doesn't happen to hop on, I'm happy to continue the conversation and just get it started before, she gets back in. And so I think what Katie was trying to say was in terms of, what, as a session, as a group, for the particular in this panel, where we're talking about persons with disability, we can only offer so much insight into, different people's particular experiences. And so with the three panelists that we have here, they're going to be talking about their own individual experiences. It might not be applicable to everyone, so we don't have, all that expertise. But, moving forward in the future, if anyone's ever interested in terms of being an additional speaker at future events with, whatever experience they want to talk about, we'd love to have that as well. And so I think with Katie still trying to get in, I might just have our lovely panelists introduce themselves to the group. And I know that she's coming back on in just a sec. So I'm going to ask Rebecca if you could introduce yourself to our audience of who you are, what program you did and what year, and what lived experience are you bringing into this panel.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I studied abroad in Moscow, Russia in 2019/2020. I just graduated university and I have accepted a job with AmeriCorps, working in the mental health field. And I guess what experiences I bring to the conversation. Like I said, I studied abroad. I am diabetic and I also have low vision. So I have, and also my own share of mental health things going on. So I had to deal with all those going abroad.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. Kat, how about you next?
Yeah, my name is Kat Claus and my pronouns are she and hers. And I studied abroad at the Stratford Theater Festival in 2015. I currently work in the higher education sphere as an educator and an advocate. And I I'm hearing disabled and use hearing aids and assistive technology. And I am also physically disabled and I also do cope with mental illness.
Great, thanks, Kat. And so with Katie back, I'm gonna go behind the curtain again and let you take it away, Katie. Thank you.
All right, thank you all so much. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Sometimes that happens here on Denial Land in Anchorage, Alaska. So just to simply introduce myself, my name is Katie Redman. I go by she, her pronouns. I am a global health professional, recently moved to Alaska, and I am an alumni of both ICEP and I did an exchange at the University of Botswana in college, which led to a long relationship, love affair with the African continent. And then I recently had a Fulbright when the COVID-19 pandemic came out in Namibia, looking at community perceptions of tuberculosis treatment and prevention. And I was a semi-finalist to go back to this. And I'm also on the autism spectrum. I deal with a chronic illness. My ramblings are available for the world to see on YouTube with the March panel. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and let Kayla, have you already introduced yourself? Then I will yield to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kayla Allen Omeza. I did my Fulbright. I did a Fulbright student research grant in the year 2018 and 2019 in Nigeria. I'm calling from Oxford, United Kingdom. I did a master's in University of Oxford studying psychology, and I currently work at Oxford Business Review right now. Oh, and I'm autistic.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, so now that we've done introductions, I want to just start by talking about what it was like to manage disabilities and other health needs abroad. And Kat, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so my disability and my health needs are actually one of the reasons that I limited myself to study abroad. I studied abroad in Canada, and it was a wonderful experience. I am so glad that I did it, but I'm very disappointed that I only did that, or that I limited myself just to Canada, because I thought that with my disabilities that I wouldn't be able to go abroad. And that was the impression others gave me as well, which I now know as I have traveled to Costa Rica and other countries, and I will hopefully be doing work in New Zealand in the next year and a half, that I now know that to be untrue. So actually, my disability impacted me a lot less than the stereotype and stigma of having a disability did. And so that's one thing I want to address with the panel is sometimes it's not your disability that impacts your experiences, it's what others think of it, or even yourself.
No, absolutely. And one of the things that I've learned is that disability is very culturally defined. What we think is a disability in the United States may not necessarily be the same experience abroad. There's different behaviors, how different homes are set up, how different infrastructure is set up, sometimes might be a better fit. And that was definitely something that took me by surprise. And then Kayla, what are some of your thoughts in terms of being a person with a disability and other healthcare needs while doing a Fulbright research grant?
My experience is a little interesting because I actually was diagnosed with autism just a couple months before I actually left. So I had time to submit into my medical clearance. I obviously got approved for it. But I was kind of figuring my autistic self out while I was there. And I honestly had a good experience. I worked with psychiatrists, and they were really understanding whenever I had at least I knew exactly what was going on this time. Whenever I had like anxiety problems or meltdowns, I knew the term, and they were really understanding. I never really like disclosed that I was autistic to my work colleagues, but they were really understanding of just general like, oh, I don't feel well kind of situations. And my friends I met there were mainly medical students at the local school, and they were very understanding. Honestly, the most understanding people I've ever met in past and present about autism. So I had a good experience there.
No, that's really good to hear. And then, yeah, just to kind of illustrate, I was diagnosed with autism at the age of 5. Kayla was just diagnosed before she started her exchange experience as an adult. So there's going to be a diverse experiences also by how long you've had a disability and how much time you've had to manage it and what it means in your life. So, Rebecca, what are your thoughts on this topic in terms of what it was like for you to navigate diabetes and low vision while in Russia?
Yeah. Similar to the other panelists, my experience was really positive as well. Um, I'll start with the low vision. So I lived in Moscow, and Moscow has one of the best public transportation systems in the world that I've ever been to, and I've heard a lot of other people say the same thing. It's you have trains coming every 30 seconds, the bus is coming every few minutes, whatever. So as a person with low vision, it's really easy for me to get around. And I grew up in rural, in the rural Midwest, and like I bike everywhere, I guess, here. Um, but we don't have that in America to that extent as they have in Moscow. So navigating the city was super easy for me, and it was a welcome change. My diabetes was pretty manageable as well. My host mom was really like helpful. She, always asked me to make sure things were doing good and that my blood sugars were good, and she looked out for me. And my teachers were understanding of both the diabetes and the low vision. So overall, I had a good experience with managing my disabilities and medical things abroad.
No, that's good to hear. And I'm glad you brought up transportation because I think that is a concern that a lot of people who do have medical and mental needs and disabilities going abroad think about. I was actually joking with the panel when we were doing our dry run of there needs to be like a database of similar to like when Fulbright, when you get when you're a finalist for a research grant, there's a crowdsourced Google Doc sheet that can explain like when you found out in the timeline. But just even like saying, hey, what's it like in terms of driving? What are the expectations on these pieces would be super helpful. But as somebody that was a late bloomer for driving, I also have been surprised that in countries where everybody's dependent on public transportation, it tends to be more reliable. Can't speak to every single need. Mini buses in on the African continent not necessarily are the most equipped for mobility needs, but I definitely know somebody that has struggled to drive that was huge as an autistic. But Rebecca, I also want to follow up with you because a huge thing that I've heard as somebody that also has a condition linked to lifestyle changes and having to watch what I eat, else I'll be in bad pain. How it was like for you to navigate diabetes in Russia, where maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a lot of starches in that diet, and how did you make that work?
Yeah, so I would say it wasn't super difficult transitioning because it was like I've had to deal with diet changes my whole life basically. I go to different people's houses or I go to restaurants. So um since I have had a lot of experience with diet changes, I kind of knew what to expect. And yeah, you're right, the starches are really big in that diet. So I did have to account for that. But overall it wasn't super difficult. Russia has, pop or soda or whatever with sugar in it, just like we do. So I have that if I need it for low blood sugar. They also have a lot of vegetables and meat in their diet. Well, vegetables more so than meat, but so I also had those options as well. So overall, it wasn't super difficult, and I think I ate a lot healthier there than I do here. So it was actually probably better for my diabetes in the long run once I kind of settled in to the new diet.
No, thanks for elaborating because I just know that's a concern that everybody has. Like, even if you're a vegetarian, but like if you have diabetes, people are like, well, we don't have the food for you. What do you do? So here's proof. You can figure out how to make it work, y'all. Um, all right. And then I want to start with Kayla for this next question. What did you notice of how Nigerians perceived people with disabilities? And did you have a chance to interact with others that might have been autistic or other disabilities while you were abroad? And yes or no, both are both valid answers. So, oh, sorry. Um, I will go to Kat next, and then you can follow up on the diet too. So,
Oh, sorry, am I next?
yes, sorry. Yeah,
Oh,
I'm just moving.
Oh, my bad. Okay, so I guess what surprised me the most was that people saw me as like an American first. So people saw me as American before they saw me as autistic. So everyone's like, "Oh, why is Kayla like not making eye contact? Why is Kayla really fidgety?" And people who didn't really, most people there didn't really know too much about America. So they're like, oh, don't mind her, she's just American. They don't make eye contact. They're really fidgety in America. It's fine, kind of thing. And everyone just went with it, and I was just really seen as like an American, as was what Americans do, kind of thing. And I realized, like a couple months later, I realized that wasn't the case for local Nigerians. That a lot of them were, most of them were undiagnosed if they had disability, and they were usually left out of the school system or really struggling behind. I actually wrote an article with one of my friends who was a med student at UI, at University of Ibadan, and we wrote about how to like combat like the stigma of disabilities in Nigeria. So I never really met anybody who at least had a disclosed disability while I was in Nigeria. It's a little disappointing, but I have been kind of like writing a little bit of advocacy work with that.
No, that's good to know. Thank you. And then Kat, if you wanted to follow up on Rebecca's question, then respond about what the experience was seeing how people perceive disabilities and if you interacted with other groups while you were abroad.
Yeah, so I have a few multitude of disabilities that I take medication for. And one of the things in medication is I, of course, need to have something in my stomach, which is common with a lot of medications. And that's been a big adjustment for me, is planning enough food to bring on the trip. Because what if you're stuck in traffic? What if this has happened? And like, what food is safe to take across the border? Like, what won't? I used to take granola bars, but a lot of granola bars have chocolate in them and they'd be a melty mess. So I had to find like oat bars that are filling for my stomach. And it's a small thing, but it's an extra expense that I had to do anytime I was traveling, and extra things to worry about. My medications need to be kept a certain temperature. So I have a little cooler that I bought. So, you know, even if we're stuck in 90-degree days and they get left in the car, they're safe. And so the same with food. And I think that it's an extra consideration that I don't think a lot of people have appreciation for. With those with complex healthcare needs. It's not just the medication that you need to bring, it's the safe storage. It's can you bring it across the border legally, which I ran into that I could not at one point. And so I think it also just ties into the impression we have of those who are living with disabilities. I am a young-ish individual. I'm nearing my 30s. And so people have this impression that those who are young won't have mobility issues. And I do have mobility issues. And there's been times where I've been using wheelchairs for months on time. And I think that when I tell people I'm disabled, they think, oh, did you like break your leg in a skiing accident? Like, what was this one thing that happened to you? Rather than understanding that it's an everyday part of my life. And there's, you know, oh, when are you going to get better? Well, there's no such thing, you know, as better for me. This is my life. And I think it's, you know, and I'm comfortable with it, but I ran into a lot of impressions of what a disabled person looks like, especially with mobility issues. And when I would ask for accommodations, like, oh, you know, I can't quite make the stairs, you know, I can't hear that. Could you repeat that? I don't think people know how to handle it, especially in a younger individual. So like I said, I think there's a lot of stigma with others and then stigma with myself. As I mentioned briefly earlier, the reason I chose to study in Canada rather than other countries that I wanted to visit, which was Poland and Germany, is because I didn't think I could. And I think that my own self-doubt and, you know, stigma in my own mind held me back from experiencing the most amount of opportunities that I wish I could.
No, absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing. I also take antidepressants every day, not ashamed, and I need to have food and access to food. And so it's also that planning piece. So it's not as intensive as needing refrigeration, but it's definitely a logistic that you have to figure out, okay, if I'm going to be in a rural area, how am I going to get XYZ? But I will say, I have found that people that do have to have medication are able to have to juggle some of these conversations, are a lot more equipped to handle things when things hit the fan, because you're in an unfamiliar environment. You can prepare for everything and it's all unexpected and an adventure, right? So no, thank you so much for sharing. And I completely hear you as somebody that is this close to 30. You know, it is very interesting. And part of that is just also how America, again, frames disability. We've continued to frame it as a lot of people with disabilities are people who are older, because disability is the only identity you can walk into just by life circumstance. And young people, we like to think are invincible. They don't want to think that they can get sick. They don't want to think that their bodies are not perfect and things can just happen. So it's just been very interesting, and I appreciate the way you frame this as disability is not this black and white experience. It's a very gray experience. There can be periods of times when people are in a wheelchair. There can be periods of times when I'm in a meltdown, and it's not this consistent state necessarily, or for most healthcare needs. So, and then Rebecca, what did you see when you were in Russia? Did you hear any bits and pieces about people with disabilities? Did you run into anybody else that had diabetes or low vision?
Yeah, so Russia overall, it's like my like supervisor, well not supervisor, but the person from the study abroad program who was also in Russia with us. He's basically he would always say Russia's about 20, 30 years behind us in terms of socially like accepting certain things. So there is still a lot of stigma in Russia especially when it comes to mental health. And I think also physical health, but I'm not as sure on that. So when I was in Russia, I did notice that I hardly ever saw anyone out and about who had mobility issues or who was in in a wheelchair, for example. Especially, I don't think I saw maybe one person, or people with like visible mental illnesses or anything like that. Or maybe a couple times I would see people who had like an outward disability. Um, so there is a lot of stigma, but I didn't meet anyone who had diabetes there. I didn't meet anyone who had a disclosed mental illness. My host mom did say that her friend has diabetes, so she so she was able to like understand some of my stuff, so which was nice. But yeah, there is a lot of stigma still in Russia, and the research that I have done on the topic is kind of sad, but I hopefully they will start improving. It seems like people our age and the younger generations are starting to become more accepting. So we'll see how that goes in the future. But
Yeah, no, and thank you for sharing. And I think this is also really enforces the point that people that live in these countries are not aliens. They have the same bodies and body parts as we do, and therefore have the same healthcare issues. May there not be as many people with multiple sclerosis in sub-Saharan Africa. Not necessarily. Maybe we're not measuring it well, but that's what I found. And especially, you can watch the YouTube clip when I talk about what it was like to have a mental breakdown in Namibia, where I was put on antidepressants. The amount of Namibians that I found that had mental health concerns was, it would shock probably a lot of international providers. And so it also sends this message when we say that Americans are too fragile to go to these countries. That it shows these countries that these people are also too fragile to get access to care and needs. So the more people that are able to go and talk and plant these cognitive seeds that, autism is not just this negative thing in a textbook, people who get resources. And if you give these resources to your people, I've had some very empowering conversations that way. I always try to reinforce that point anytime I can, that the same challenges we experience are experienced by other countries. Okay, I am going to switch more into the technical experiences. I also, because I know I got cut off, want to remind people about our Q&A session. I'm going to try and stop 10 minutes before so we can answer some things in the chat. We definitely want to hear from you and your perspectives as well. So please feel free to enter those as well. So this time, I will start with Rebecca, and I just wanted to hear a bit more about how did your exchange program provide accessibility? Did you notice things that they did? Any additional accommodations? And if you can just speak to that, whether that's the host site or your home institution.
yeah, so overall, my experience was pretty good. They were generally helpful with if I needed anything. My university, like they offered help, but I don't think I needed it from them. It was mainly with my study abroad program itself. I did, they all knew about my diabetes and stuff, and they did at one point try to look up my medications on a like Russian like a pharmacy website. I don't think they were very successful, but they tried at least. So yeah, I would say they were overall helpful. I never was in a position where I was in urgent need of something. I did run out of test strips when I was there, so I just bought more. They have the same brand there, but just a different test strip. I don't know. So I needed to buy like a whole new blood glucose meter. But it wasn't super expensive there, so that was fine. I had enough insulin. I had enough of my other supplies, so I never ran into an issue of needing extra equipment while I was there. So yeah, I don't have a whole lot to talk about on that, but yeah, they were overall at least offering to help, willing to help. I just didn't need it, luckily. So yeah, I'd say that's about all I got in that one.
No, and that's really good to hear. And I had a very similar experience when I first studied abroad in Botswana, where I did make sure that I had the supports in place. Unlike Kat, I was really fortunate to have a study abroad provider. Shout out to Jennifer Gay, who was the ISEP coordinator at Fort Lewis College, who didn't blink twice when I said, okay, I can't afford Sweden, but I liked working in Latin America, so I think I am going to be the first in our college to try Botswana, and she didn't blink twice. And Botswana was just so supportive. Like there were some times when I had a meltdown when I cracked my computer screen and I had to figure things out. But in terms of needing access to counseling or the Disability Resource Center, it was good to know that those things were there. But like Rebecca, I didn't need it. I just was very fortunate to have a supportive group. There have been other international experiences I've had where that's not the case. And so I've had to adapt and find those supports in place. So it does depend on countries. And then Kayla, what did you notice? I know you were recent into your diagnosis, but was there anything, because you mentioned how your friends were super supportive and that your research mentors were supportive. Can you elaborate more on what were some specific strategies and techniques they might have been able to do to support you?
Yeah, so I was studying perceptions of mental health and suicidality while I was there. So and while I was there, it seemed like it was becoming a less of a taboo topic when I got there. It's increasingly, it's when people were starting to talk about it more. The third year medical students had they had a class talk, and they were bringing in like mental health people to talk about like various illnesses, and they had me talk about depression. So I was able to talk and speak to them and talk about coping skills. And my friends and I, like my friends who were also in that event, we just used them each other, like, oh, like do some grounding exercises if you're anxious and stuff like that. So we were able to really help each other from like the stuff that we all kind of learned together. In terms of like the support I had in locally, I mean, I had a therapist, a Nigerian therapist, and she was awesome. She was the best therapist I ever had. And I obviously, of course, I think my biggest issue I had there, honestly, I had a pretty bad case of malaria when I was there. So that was obviously that was fixed. But that was my biggest concern. That was pretty fine. I mean, they were really used to treating malaria in Nigeria. And the Fulbright program seemed, again, I didn't have a super urgent case, anything to have to do with autism there, just to be honest. But they seemed pretty relaxed. I wanted to go home 2 weeks early, actually. And they were like, okay, so what crisis are you in? I was like, oh, sorry, I'm not in a crisis. I just finished my work and I'm just bored kind of thing. And so, but they seemed like they would actually let me go. They would have let me go if there was an emergency. So I was appreciative of that.
No, shout out to Fulbright Assist. Best therapist I ever had. And apparently her son was also on the spectrum, so it was nice not to do autism one-on-one. I was so scared when I had my breakdown in Namibia. And again, you can watch the YouTube clips that I kept it from Fulbright just because I had a bad experience with Peace Corps and other institutions over autism. And I've struggled with an anxiety disorder for all my life. And I wish I told them sooner because, again, I found out a lot of the coordinators in country, a lot of the students that the other people worked with all struggled with depression and anxiety. And we actually were planning until darn old COVID to do a workshop on mental health stigma because people wanted to have the conversation. And it was really eye-opening to have, you wanted to talk about disability? You want to talk about mental health? I don't have to bring this up. Okay, I'll join the conversation. And that was a very new experience. It wasn't my piece, but no. And I mean, malaria is scary. I'm glad you made it out. Knock on wood. I've never had malaria, but I think it also goes to show that, especially when you have a mental health need. I wound up hospitalized in Rwanda over food poisoning when I was doing my MPH internship. And it's just that can compound with anxiety. And so having the supports in place to just make sure that, hey, your mental health is taken care of when you're in a new hospital system, which can be really traumatic, is just really good to have. All right. And then Kat, wrap up with you. What did you notice about the programs in terms of accessibility?
Yeah, so accessibility wasn't a topic covered in my program or any of my college or any of the ones I looked at who were, had a relationship with my university or related organizations. So what I'll say by that is when I looked at the program at the Study Abroad office and, the Office of International Affairs, there was glowing posters with people of every different color and gender and sexual orientation. And that was great. And I looked through different ones. I even looked at Fulbright and I looked at all the other ones, but I didn't see anybody who looked like they were living with a disability. And I flipped through the pages and read all their stories, the personal exposés from people who did all these experiences. And I didn't hear that either. So I thought that it meant that I couldn't do these opportunities because they weren't talked about, because, there was that stigma. And I was actually diagnosed with PTSD 2 months right before I left for my experience. And I had a well-meaning professor come up to me right before we left in the summer towards the end of the semester and said, "Hey, Kat, are you sure you can go?" And I know that it was well-meaning, but there's a lot of, we won't hold it against you if you back out type of thing. And even after I repeatedly advocated and said, "Thank you for your concern, but, I know my needs. Please trust me, I will be okay." They didn't listen to me advocating and understanding my own needs. Which, really took the agency out of me. And that's why I said I'm a little bit disappointed. I don't want to say settled for Canada, but I only settled to do one because I now know that, I've gone to Costa Rica and I'm planning other trips, long-term trips to do professional work. And I'm able to navigate all of my different disabilities in a world where people didn't think it was possible because nobody thought to try.
I empathize so much, even though, again, I lucked out with the supports in place to need. But no, even, I'm going to call out Fulbright for a second. They had the 30th anniversary of the ADA. And it's often when we hear about projects with disability, it's people who are lying. It's good, great people that have dedicated their lives to supporting the needs of the disability community. But it's just a very different experience when we say, hey, we have disabilities and we want to participate in this. And there's still this pushback. And I'm going to put my diversity hat on for a second. I always have to remind myself that we've framed disability and other health needs for 4,000 years as a bad thing. From ancient Sparta, when we were putting ancient babies who were deformed on a hillside to die. The Bible is a very common text that frames cultural mindsets in the United States. Blindness is implied as something that needs to be cured. So we're working with this history, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I do agree with Kat. There were so many periods in my childhood. It's like, there's no way you're going to let an autistic girl from Albuquerque, New Mexico study abroad. There's no way I can do this. And just being able to hear more. And I just also want to shout out Mobility International, which I found out through this conference is actually an organization that is trying to ensure that there is representation for students with disabilities of all sorts and all forms. So I do want to put that in there. I was going to follow up with a question, but I guess I'll just start with you, Kat, about in addition to that, what else would have been helpful with this program experience? What else could the study abroad program, besides marketing and making assumptions, was there anything that could have been done differently to help you?
I think this is a good case of you don't know what you don't know, and starting those conversations, because I did my experience when I was 21. I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and it was my first time abroad even, so I didn't know any of that, of what to expect. And I think that these should be standard questions, because I didn't voluntarily, announce, "So I'm going on this trip, I have a disability," right away, because I thought that that would disqualify me. And I'm also a queer woman. And so I didn't just raise my hand to be like, "I have queer questions," which in hindsight, I wished I did, for those who are comfortable. But I think that there's also this assumption that people know who are going on these trips, that you can see every diversity facet about a person, and that, you know, your different identities don't impact your experience, which is completely false. Who you are as a person and what you bring, whether it's a person who's disabled, queer, you know, a BIPOC individual, or even what culture you're from. If you're from the rural city, you bring those experiences and history with you. And that's also something that should be celebrated. And so I wish that they had started those conversations, and I think that those should just be built-in questions no matter where, because whether anybody going on that trip is disabled or not, they will likely run into people with disabilities in their life. Whether it's on that study abroad trip or not, these are all accessibility questions everyone should be made aware of.
Absolutely. And that's what I wanted to follow up on. Sorry, I now remember my follow-up question. But first, just to reflect, sometimes it's one of the best things for your mental health to also leave a setting and to kind of have a chance to reflect and piece things, in my experience. So like, that's also like, there's this assumption, like there's so much going on in the States. Sometimes it's good to have a chance to have that opportunity to have a chance to clear. But Kat, if you could just give a quick insight on that whole question of disclosure, like when do you disclose? Do you regret disclosing? Was there a different way you would have? That's a bigger question, but I'm just curious if you have some quick thoughts.
Yeah, I don't want to say I regret disclosing, but I wish I knew more about myself and how to advocate before I disclose. Because like I said, there is that stigma to saying I'm a person diagnosed with PTSD with a hearing and physical mobility issue. And when they hear physical mobility issue, they think that means a set of stairs will take me down. And, you know, I know my own healthcare needs at that time. I can manage stairs, you know, and there's all that stigma that goes with it. So I wish when I did disclose that I had kind of a script memorized that talks about what I can and can't do, and to just emphasize the fact that I know my body, I know my needs, and I'm an adult. Everybody who does these experiences are adults, and I know how to get what I need and that I can do this opportunity. I almost let myself get talked out of it. And I did get talked out of abroad experiences, specifically in Poland, because I didn't know how to verbally, you know, express that I could do this. I didn't have that confidence and self-love. So if I could go back and talk to me when I was 21 years old, I would have a whole rant about how to advocate for yourself, because everybody knows their own body better than anybody else.
And again, it's not like the Polish people do not have mobility issues themselves or mental health issues in that desert, in that, you know, wintry places tend to have a lot of mental health concerns as well. Just saying. No, I'm just so sorry that was your experience, but I'm grateful you've had some opportunities to study abroad, and other international exchange students. I keep using study. You don't have to be a current student for some of these opportunities, and you can look at some of those, some of the panels that have happened about the specific opportunities. You can be an alumni of the school, so just a habit. But I will go to Rebecca. What do you think would have been helpful, if there was anything else that an exchange program could have done to be helpful, if Russia could have been done, or just any tips? And then maybe just speaking to that disclosure piece.
Yeah, I've thought about this a little bit, and I was mostly happy with how my program, like the resources that they had. I guess the one thing that I thought of was it would have been nice to be able to talk with someone who lives in the country I was going to be like, hey, if you know, does Russia have, for example, I don't know, does it have like wheelchair ramps or whatever you might need, you know, because it's hard to always find that information online. So I feel like, you know, having if they have the, you know, connections, maybe it'd be good to talk to someone who actually lives in that country, to help you make your decision if it's the right place for you to go. Um, but other than that, um, my program, I was pretty happy with my program. Yeah, I would just say like communicate as much as possible, back and forth if there is something that you need, or on both sides. Like, you know, my program wasn't always the best at communicating. Um, as for disclosing, I'm trying to remember. I disclosed, I think, early on because I had, you know, I'm not going to go to a place that doesn't have, you know, access to insulin or something. Um, so I obviously had to ask about that. I can't remember when the low vision thing came up. I think it came up pretty early because I'm just like, hey, you know, do you have X, Y, and Z in Russia? But I had no issues with it. I didn't feel any judgment. But like I said, I didn't I don't remember a whole lot. I wish I could remember more. But yeah, I don't remember feeling any judgment or anything. I just asked my questions. So maybe that's not the best answer, but
No, I think it's a good answer because that is the goal. You know, I think when you hear from some of our perspectives, we have some pain still because we didn't feel supported. And the fact that your memory is able to think about only the positive and that you were accommodated, I mean, that gives me so much hope that, and you know, I kind of feel that way about Botswana. Like, I do feel like I look at it in rose-colored glasses because it was just such an awesome experience. Even though there were challenges, there was definitely some accessibility issues that we had to navigate and other things, but I don't remember them because the experience overall was one of the best in my life. And so I think, you know, I'm so happy for you that while reflecting, those are your memories, because that's the hope you have for any international experience. So absolutely a valid answer. All right. And then Kayla, I will wrap up with you in terms of what would be other things from the application process with the exchange program? And also, if you want to speak to that disclosure piece, like what you've learned and pieces of disclosure about this.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess so. I found there was a kind of a slight barrier, not a slight, a barrier of entry to for those with undiagnosed disabilities, especially in the Fulbright program. And the Fulbright, they at least when I applied, which was about 2 or 3 years ago, they said you have to have 3 references, and those cannot be character references. They have to talk about the feasibility and the viability of the grant. So I took that very literally. I take everything very literally. So I told my letter of recommendation writers, please don't write a character reference. Please just talk about the grant and talk about how it was viable and feasible kind of thing. And so no one talked about anything about my character. And the character reference is basically coming from your university affiliator. And the university affiliator, we just talked for about 20 minutes. They interviewed me to try to figure out if I was a good ambassador potential, if I knew enough about the country I was going to. And I just felt like as an autistic person, it's hard to, sometimes there's a lot of misunderstandings with like neurodivergent and neurotypical people about like just how people interact. So I think long story short, I didn't win the first 2 times I applied, and I was applying to my school, but I won the 3rd time and nothing really changed except I applied outside of my school without the character reference basically. And I just wonder, and I'm not all the way sure, but I wonder if it had something to do with just how I was presenting for those 20 minutes, if I didn't seem just something, I didn't seem enough of something basically, and that character. So I mean, if my piece of advice for anybody listening would be to kind of implement like a character reference for like maybe a professor that you like, as I had professors that I knew since like my freshman year kind of thing that could have really spoken to like how I could have been a good ambassador potential, or kind of speak like, okay, like at least one person can kind of just talk more about character than just the grant itself. And so it's like another supplement to the university affiliator that only speaks with you for about 20 minutes. So that would be my suggestion. Disclosing, I didn't disclose that I was autistic to my coworkers, to my colleagues. I did to my friends like 7 months in the grant, and then they were like, "Oh, okay," kind of thing. They're like, "Oh, I thought those," because again, they just thought I was just American kind of thing, and I just didn't make eye contact because I was American. So they were like, "Oh, okay, wow, I didn't know that was different." Okay, so they were really cool about it, and they were really nice. I'm still learning myself if I should disclose in work settings and school settings. I did when I was in Oxford, as a student in Oxford. When I disclosed I had disability, so I was able to get a combination, and I was so happy I did. If anyone's ever thinking about doing that, I would highly suggest, if you haven't yet, I would highly suggest it. It was a lot better experience than my undergrad without having a combination. It was so much better. I had a note taker, I had extra time on tests and everything. I just didn't know I needed all that, but I really did. And yeah, I would recommend disclosing it when appropriate. But I honestly, I'm still trying to learn, like in social situations, like when to disclose.
Absolutely. And I'm not making eye contact because I'm trying to monitor the chat for any input or questions and trying to look at the camera. Can't pull the autism card on this one. But no, and I think that's just so important. I think also disclosure comes down to if you do have a life-threatening condition, um, there also is a limited agency. And for me, and this is my global health perspective speaking, like I have almost always disclosed to the program that I'm on the autism spectrum because I have been in security issues. I had to be evacuated due to COVID. And you never know how your body's going to react to those perspectives. And so I would feel better. It's common courtesy to say that I am prone to meltdowns before they happen, although knock on wood, they happen few and far in between. Thank goodness for maturity and coping mechanisms and medication. But like, it's not very a clear-cut thing, but I would wish that we didn't have to have this as a question, because the fear is, why don't we disclose? Why do we have to have this conversation? And in the end, we didn't have any say in this. It's just a fact of our lives, challenging as it may be. And, it shouldn't be this piece. And so I turned 29 last week, and I'm just at the point in my life where I'm like, I'm going to put all my cards on the table. Are you serious about inclusion? Then I'm going to put this in my personal statement, because this is what motivates my interest in health disparities and helps me relate to other populations and other communities that have struggled with healthcare systems, because I live it. But it's all about being upfront, all about being an experience. But I will say, especially if you're applying for Fulbright, consider disclosing that in your personal statement, because it's an absolute valid part about why you will bring more empathy and more perspective than some of the other applicants. If you've got your perspectives, use them. All right. So I can have us go for more questions. But I am curious if there are any Q&As, and I'm not seeing any. Okay, yeah, there we go. So to each of you, and I think I will start with Rebecca this time, how do your host countries' perceptions of disabilities, how do you think they're going to evolve in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said earlier, I think at least for Russia, especially with younger people, it is slowly starting to change to a more acceptable society, I guess. So we'll see if in like 30 years or so, if they're where we are now, which is, there's always room for improvement. So yeah, that would be my answer to that. I'm not an expert on on social change in the history of everything in Russia, but I do know from the young people I've talked to, they are definitely becoming more open, not just to like disabilities or health issues, but also to issues like LGBTQ plus. So yeah, I'm hopeful that it will change, but I can't say for certain. We'll have to see in like 30 years how it goes.
Oops, on mute. All right, and then Kayla, how do you think it's being shaped in Nigeria with all your advocacy work there?
I mean, the only way it can go is up at this point. And I'm hopeful of just talking to everybody I talk to in Nigeria that things are, the stigma is being taken down basically. And, especially, I mean, I lived in a hospital area. I lived with medical students. I worked with doctors and everything. And it seemed like the stigma it seemed like in the past 5 years, people were more like respectful and talking especially about mental health, mental illnesses, people with disabilities coming in. So it's really, I think it's only like if the medical field does it, then it would hopefully like more like people would as well. And I'm excited about the future of like tolerance in Nigeria.
Oh, good to hear. And then Kat, what are some of your thoughts? What have you noticed in the countries you've been to?
Yeah, I also just want to mention that I spent an extensive amount of time in Costa Rica, and I think that I'm actually surprised that I faced so much, I don't want to call it discrimination, but othering is what I would call it. So I would disclose that I have a disability, and I would feel like this wall would come up in Canada and Costa Rica and in the US. I'm very surprised by how similar all these three countries are, just because they're otherwise, very different countries with, very different customs. And it seems to be that there's this pervasive stigma in a lot of communities about disabilities and perceptions of disabilities. I touched upon it earlier. I'm a young person with a hearing and physical disability, and I also have, mental disabilities and mental illness. And I think that it's starting to get better in modern times. There's a lot of good media out there, a lot of good representation, but I also worry that just with the representation that I do see in these countries, that it's the most extreme example. So you think if somebody has a mobility issue, they must be paralyzed from the waist down, rather than that idea that, like you said earlier, disability is a gray area. It is a spectrum, and it's sometimes changing individual to individual, or it can change from day to day. And so I hope that in the next 20 years or so, we'll get some more vibrant representation that's more realistic to all the different spectrums that individuals with disabilities have themselves. And I'm really hopeful that it'll continue to go. Like I said earlier, I'm almost 30, and we've come a very far way since I was a child. So I'm hoping in the next 30 years, we can go a lot farther.
No, absolutely. And I'm a recovering pessimist and a very pragmatic realist. So I share the optimism people were experiencing. I also think mental health is a huge component of this. I think we've seen so many of our younger generations experiencing mental health challenges, not just in our country, but in other countries as well, and are realizing this whole not talking about stuff is just not going to go well. Stigmatizing people because of their bias and things that are out of their control just isn't working. It's actually making the mental health crisis worse. And that's the other component, is it's also environment. Disability and mental health concerns and health concerns also change and are dependent on the environment and what supports you have in place. But Kat, you wanted to follow up with something.
Yeah, I just wanted to have a quick adage about disability perceptions and this idea that it just limits you, that my disability is something inherently negative. So besides the fact that I'm an educator and it has provided me with more empathy and understanding and wonderful planning skills, because if I want to go somewhere, I have to have the cooler, my meds, I have to check the country to make sure I can get access to my medication. Got to call 12 doctors' offices, all of that. There's also a lot of things that has enabled me to do. So I did some theater work in my youth, and actually, when I went to the Stratford Theater Festival, the focus was theater. And I like to joke that I have a superpower. So as a person with a hearing disability, I've become more reliant on the vibration of sounds. And so I notice where it's coming from. And a cute example of that is I was in a theater once, and they were addressing the speakers to make sure that the sound was correct. And nobody else could feel what was wrong. Everybody else who had normal hearing was wandering around because something felt funny. And I was able to feel that there wasn't sound coming from one of the speakers. So I think they called me Batgirl after that, because I could feel it. And they jokingly said I was using sonar to figure it out. But that's a different skill that I would have never had. Perhaps if I had been born with, normal hearing, I wouldn't be able to be attuned to those different things in life. And I think that as much as my disability sometimes complicates things, especially when I want to travel internationally, it also gives me this entire wealth of new experiences that I'm actually thankful that I have been able to experience.
No, well said. And I think each of us could show how actually this challenge that we've been thrown at in our lives, a challenge isn't necessarily a bad thing. It makes me a really dang good problem solver. And again, I'll paraphrase what I said before, is that I worry about students that have never had to deal with adversity when they go abroad, who might have to call the doctors when something happens and they don't know what to do. When I had a crisis happen in Namibia, I at least knew, okay, this is not normal. I need to go and do all these pieces. I did feel stigmatized about reporting things, which again, I think is a fixable issue. And I think we're realizing that, hey, this is not really working for us. And there's that piece. So there is a question that came in for Kat, and anybody else, if you care to speak to it, if you're comfortable. But in the queer community you immersed yourself in, was it mostly locals in country or in other expats?
I immersed myself, well, I guess it depends, in Costa Rica and Canada with locals from that country. So, I mean, the Stratford Theatre Festival is a very intensive theater program where people come all over the world to see it. But a lot of what I was doing was in rural Canada for part of it. So that is an entirely different group. And so that is one other caveat that I will give. When you look up information for where you're going to go, don't just look at the big cities. The big cities are great. Please also experience them. But my experience in rural Canada in Toronto was very different. My experience traveling the foothills around San Jose was very different than actually being in the city of San Jose. And so I think you need to think of, and at least when I do planning, I write a sheet with rural and urban, and I write out the different concerns I have in each area because oftentimes they are very different.
No, and I'm somebody that just loves going into rural areas and doing grassroots work in the community. I was super excited when I was sent out to semi-rural Alaska for work 2 weeks ago. I will go anywhere. No, and I also just want to reiterate, also to bear in mind that especially communities that experience other forms of oppression might also share some of that bias and that cultural bias with disability, or they're not able to focus on that piece. So these intersectional concerns and pieces also fly in here. And I will say, just again, speaking only from my point of view, there's a lot more pressure in the rural communities in sub-Saharan Africa that I worked in Latin America than there was in the urban areas to keep a lot of that under wraps. But I knew there were trans people in the communities I served in Peace Corps, which was a very conservative Amazulu community that adopted Christianity. So you never know. But also just to bring that, also just to raise that with disabilities and other things as well. So. Seeing no questions, we have until 15 after the hour, which is different from March when we had to get cut off 50 minutes in. So, if
Sorry
anybody,
to interrupt, Katie. Yeah, it looks
yeah,
like
go
there
ahead.
is a question for those who had therapists in therapy during their time abroad. What differences did you find with your therapy in your host country that you think differs from mental health services in the U.S.? And I'm happy to start that off quickly now that I see that question. I don't know if it's directly to me or in Q&A. I think it's in Q&A. So I was fortunate when I went to Canada to be able to still use my university mental health services and keep them. But originally I had to fight for that. I was told that they don't do virtual consultations. And now that we're in COVID time, that's obviously a lie. They do that for everybody now. But when I went abroad for a longer time in San Jose, I found local services, even though I was only going to be there for a few weeks because I knew that it was important to my mental health. And what I found the differences in the country, besides the struggle of finding somebody who spoke English, because English is my primary language, was the difference in approach. So in America, when I received mental health support services, they always asked me like, what is, there would be a question about like, how can therapy cover it? Like, what have you been diagnosed with in the past was always the question. Like, what is wrong with you is a nice way of phrasing it. But when I was outside San Jose, there was a question about what can I do to help support you live a happier life? So it didn't matter what had happened in my past, there's more questions forward thinking. And I don't want to extrapolate from just one experience, but knowing the way speaking to locals about other things, they are always looking forward, whereas mental health in the US is kind of looking backwards towards past problems.
Absolutely. And I can jump in, but I want to give a chance. Rebecca or Kayla, do you want to speak to this?
Sure. So I had a therapist when I was in Nigeria for 9 months. I had a local Nigerian therapist, and I honestly, I also had a therapist when it was obviously I had a therapist mainly because I was transitioning to a new environment, a new job, and obviously a new continent. And right before, like 2 years before, I worked at Duke, and I had a therapist for the exact same reason. And I honestly, I didn't really see much of a difference in like strategy or approach. It was more just kind of just trying to figure out like, oh, so what do you think this person means when she said that? Okay, let's try to work on this together. Okay, when you get home, try to do this and this kind of thing. It was the same. I honestly, that was the same thing. I was really pleasantly surprised. I enjoyed my Nigerian therapist more than all my other therapists. So she was very supportive, and she was very very passionate about my well-being, which I haven't really. I think they had fewer cases. They had fewer patients, so I think it was better. But it was definitely a lot of privilege, a lot of American privilege. I had it was very inaccessible for a lot of locals. A lot of people, a lot of my friends were like, "Oh, how much does it cost?" And like I was being paid an American salary, so I was like, "Oh, like $20 kind of thing," and per session, which is like way too much money. The naira is like 500 naira to a dollar kind of thing, and it's just way too much money for people, and a lot of like especially students, young people in Nigeria. So I wish that was more accessible, because it was really well done. The therapists, they were really they were great.
Awesome. And then I will give Rebecca a chance to speak if you want to. But if you're good, just let me know. But I can definitely speak. Oh, go ahead. All right. I will just speak a little bit on this because, again, there's an entire YouTube clip. But I will say I found that the therapists abroad also often have the American bias. So I took psychopathology because I was which is abnormal psych. I was too much of a chicken to do that in the States because I knew it was going to be a rough class. And it was by an American professor in Botswana with an American textbook going over the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Illness. But it was really great to be in that class and to say, like, hey, I actually live with autism. It's not just this thing in the textbook. And actually, some of the other students were like, actually, I might be having a sleeping disorder, which I know we say in like psychology class, we should not be diagnosing ourselves by the DSM when we go into those classes. But in this case, it was a very humanizing thing to realize, oh, these are just human behaviors and I can have them. It's not a us versus our thing. I will say, though, for Namibia, I'm often the first person that they see because people will see, like, what's your history with therapy? And they're kind of taken aback that I've been in therapy for most of my life because I'm on the autism spectrum. And in Namibia, when I was presenting with meltdowns and a pretty serious mental health crisis and scared, like it was the first time in my life I actually had the word institutionalization brought up. And that add to a bunch of stigma that I had to work through with my Fulbright therapist, because I initially went to Namibia when I was doing this. And so it was more accessible, again, white American privilege. And I basically was able to, I was 28 when this happened, or 27 when this happened. And so I was able to say, like, okay, you know what? I know this isn't normal. This is my history. I had a psychology degree. I can say this is what's happening. I don't think it's going to escalate, but I don't want it to escalate. And this is why I need help now. So it was definitely a lot more accessible. But, if you are the only person that presents with this particular condition, I found that they kind of added to that stigma of autism. And, people think that autism is inability to adapt to your environment and those things. And so there are some really damaging pieces. But what I would do as like a lesson learned, I have learned that I have to not be picky with therapists. I know, like, it's great to have people that have your same race, your ethnicity, your background. And so I'm like, you know what? I need to just articulate what are the things I'm comfortable with that are going to help me get through this experience, and just work on those pieces and prioritize those pieces while protecting my privacy. Because, it's exhausting to do autism one-on-one unless I feel comfortable doing those pieces. And like, even now, I think I'm going to have to find another therapist in Alaska, not because they're not a bad person, but just because it's not a good fit. And it's the similar process. Now, you may not have that same flexibility when you are abroad. And so just to be prepared for that, and just to know, okay, what are the basic needs? Do you need help adjusting? What are the specific pieces with adjusting, and being able to learn and cope? Last thing I also want to say is, even if somebody has to leave the country when they're abroad, even if they are institutionalized for a particular international experience, it does not rule out the entire experience for everybody. I was so scared, and I still feel scared about losing my global health career every time I speak out about this. But there's so many people who deal with this. And we need to kind of get to this thing where mental health is not stagnant, and you can have these experiences, some very serious mental health crises, and some people may decide to never do another international experience, and that's okay. But for those of us where we have found comfort in similar environments in the past, one bad experience doesn't define your liability risk. You just have to put that out there for everybody, because it needs to be reiterated for that perspective. So, and that's,
Thank you
yeah,
for
go ahead.
bringing that up, Katie. That brings up a wonderful point. You were talking a lot about some of the stigmas that we have. And one of my degrees is in English. And so I love the meanings of words. Stigma, roughly translated in Latin, means to mark or tattoo. And I think it's really telling that that's the origin of the word, because to me, anytime I've disclosed my disability or mental health issues or physical health issues, I feel like it puts like a big like tattoo on my forehead that says defective, can't participate, and things like that. And that it's automatically a label that I'm stuck with forever. There has been times in my life where I'm fortunate to be without health instances for multiple months. And despite that, how differently I feel like the perception and stigma is always that I'm always this one way. And so that's why I think words matter. I generally try to use a person living with disability or a disability or a person living with mental illness rather than just saying a disabled person, because that's a permanent modifier. It puts the disability before me. So when you speak in language, the most important part usually goes first. And the way we speak about that in a lot of English languages, to me, is backwards. It's always people first. It's the people and then the descriptors. And I think that that's why it matters. And I think that the more we have these conversations and put people first and good representation, that, you know, despite the stigma, you know, you're not permanently this one way, and you having one bad experience does not prevent you from having multiple, you know, good experiences abroad.
100. No, absolutely. And it's just a very interesting take within the community. I tend to be disability first, because I'm like, why are you scared of disability? Why are we still othering disability? But it's the respect, you know, different people have different experiences. If people getting into a car accident was their worst day in their life with a disability, that's going to be there. But it's also going back to English, where English is not the first language in a lot of the countries that we're working in. It's also, how do we set the tone, and how do we try and not increase stigma in those experiences for the local community. All right, thank you. I appreciate the questions. We still have plenty of time, so keep them coming. I will start with Kayla on this one, but all panelists, what advice do you have for future applicants with disabilities that want to participate in an international exchange?
I would say, I mean, I would just say just go for it, basically. Get the support you need. Definitely disclose when you're applying, so you can get so you just have the resources for any support you need from the program itself. Like, take it into your own discretion with like disclosing for and obviously in other situations like social settings and workplace settings and stuff. But I would recommend to just go for it. I don't see any reason to not go for it. When I was in undergrad, I had an opportunity to go to Japan for study abroad, and it's funny because I lived there before. I lived there when I was a kid. So, but when I had like a panic attack, like just a few months before I went, and I just freaked out. I was like, oh, I can't have anxiety while I'm in Japan, kind of thing. And so I just didn't go, and it didn't make any sense. I should have went, kind of thing. So I really urge people to go and to share their experiences and to be open about experiences, encourage other people to go as well.
Absolutely. And then Rebecca, what are some thoughts about people possibly with diabetes that might want to go to other countries, or low vision, or anybody with a health concern who wants to go to Russia?
Yeah, so I I would agree a lot with what Kayla said. I would say don't let things stop you from um traveling. I would also say, you know, be realistic. It's important to plan. It's important to make sure that you will be, you know, safe and covered if something does happen. Um, so I would say, you know, it's annoying and it's frustrating, but you know, plan ahead. Talk with your insurance or your doctors. And get any kind of arrangements needed for your medication, and make sure you at least have a general understanding of the environment you're going into. But I would say don't, unless for some reason you feel like you just can't go because, you know, for me, like, for example, it's like if Russia had like no insulin, I'm obviously not going because I could die, and that's not what I want to do in Russia. So I would say as long as you have, you know, do your research, but don't let, you know, it's frustrating, it's annoying. I would say don't let that stop you. I don't regret going, and it was definitely stressful, intimidating to plan it, but it was worth it. So and I also wanted to say, like, back to the mental health thing, the therapist thing, I didn't have a therapist when I was abroad, but I wish I did. So I would say, even if you haven't been to a therapist before, but at least know if you will have access to one, maybe through your university, because it's a huge change. And sometimes it's nice to just have someone to talk to, because when I was abroad, I had like horrible anxiety and depression, and I was lucky enough to have someone to talk to who wasn't a therapist, but just someone who I could talk to. So I would say make sure you do have that kind of support system to help you with that change as much as possible. So I would say, yeah, plan, but don't let that stop you.
Yeah, know what your resources are available and that you will, and have confidence that you can solve problems. You know, even if you don't have a mental crisis, there's going to be challenges when you're abroad. Hands down, absolutely. Other thing I'm just going to mention about mental health before I let Kat wrap us up is also be aware that a lot of travel insurance does not cover mental health care, which is the bane of my existence, and it is not okay. Any international providers that are listening to this call, I've had to budget. I've had to budget and be like, okay, if I have to pay $100 for a session, I need to work enough time before I go abroad for these experiences. So just to put that out there is just the reality to plan for. And then Kat, I'll let you finish up the question.
Yeah. So also just to give a little note to those, if there's anybody administrating some kind of international exchange program or study abroad program, an institution of higher education or otherwise, I get questions all the time when I disclose that I'm a disabled individual who travels internationally and advocates for that, what they can do to support more individuals like me going out there. And I think that it's also a lack of resources. So when I did my study abroad, I was fortunate to have funding, which covered 99% of everything I wanted to do. Like most students did. There was a big scholarship, or excuse me, grant, which is great, but I had additional expenses. And so if you really want to have diversity, equity, and inclusion in these programs, some of that will include earmarking funds for it. Like I had to buy special programs or special bags for my medication. And 2 days before I went abroad, I realized my medication was illegal. So I had to call my doctor and get an alternative medication, and all these different considerations that are different for people with complex needs that I think need to also be talked about as a barrier to access. And so my advice to those who want to, do any kind of international experience, just like everybody said, Kayla and Rebecca said, please don't let your own stigma hold you back like it did for me. I wish I had went to Poland when I had the chance in my undergraduate degree, but I also wish I had known what questions to ask. And so that is my second advice, is really think about what you need as a person. And this applies to those who are living with or without disabilities. And write that down. You can have a list and say, you say that doesn't have this, but this is all I need. And all of these things are available here. And so practice getting comfortable talking to yourself. It sounds corny, but I totally practiced what I was going to say in the mirror because I have a work experience in New Zealand, hopefully in a year and a half. And I disclosed that I was a queer disabled woman. And thankfully, New Zealand has wonderful healthcare, but I had it all ready to go. And if they had asked, I would have been able to advocate for myself, because I know that is important.
100. And also, I practiced this and talked to myself. Still didn't change the fact that I accidentally kicked myself out of Hopin when I started this session. So practice and be prepared, but also be okay with the ambiguity. And I also think living with health needs and concerns, that's one of the things that I found as an advantage, is that I actually, contrary to popular belief, can handle a lot more change and shakeups and know how to manage things. It isn't fun, but it's that piece of that that's there. And I just want to, I've been fortunate to be a part of these panels twice, and I just see a commonality. Each of us have mentioned that we have mental health concerns. I also want to say, like, making people feel supported and not judging them. Like, it's so much pressure to put it on those of us that live with health needs. And that when things do go wrong, I mean, I know, like, one of the reasons I had a mental health breakdown was imposter syndrome, because I didn't feel supported at my Fulbright pre-departure orientation, because there were microaggressions towards disabilities. And, you all have earned the right to be here and to apply and to do those experiences. So I will always be shocked that I got a Fulbright, but I also know it wouldn't have been feasible if I didn't apply. And the other commonality is that each of us were told indirectly, who are the panelists in this conference, that it was not feasible for us to study abroad. And we need more people to hold our place, because that's what's going to break down stigma, and that's what's going to make things more accessible. So I'm so grateful to everybody that participated on this. You are welcome to contact us. Well, I'll let the panelists put their information if they want to be contacted again, no pressure. You're also welcome to reach out to me. I also am always willing to help with all these things. Last thing is we do have a survey, and I would encourage you all to please fill this out. This was our first time using the Hop-in application. We also might be doing this conference again, fingers crossed, if we get a grant. So we want to know what would be more input, what types of perspectives you want to hear. Please just fill out that feedback. It was truly a pleasure. Thank you so much for your patience with my technical difficulties, and I'm truly grateful to our panelists in that vulnerability. So thank you all so much. Take care and enjoy the rest of the conference.